Race doesn't limit you from anything.
all about
I feel
identity.
like they learn about race from. I teach them
What you know
about race.
about who you are with somebody else that looks like you.
And love who you are.
To love themselves.
Identity.
This is In My Skin, a podcast about race and childhood. I'm Adam Flango. When I was growing up, I was obsessed with sports. On weekends, I would stay up until the wee hours of the evening watching highlights on SportsCenter, and eventually it got to the point where they would just replay the episode that I just watched, except the advertisements would be different. There was one kind of ad, though, that always seemed to pop up. It was the kind that featured somber, harrowing images of impoverished children in an African or South American country. They usually went something like this.
So many girls and boys come into this world under these hopeless conditions. This is barely a place to sleep or eat, and it's certainly not a place to dream. With your help, life can change for the better for a child who faces life with so little. It's your choice. You can call now and help a child, or you can do nothing.
These messages certainly aren't all bad because, yes, there are children in other countries who could benefit from donations and help. But when these are the primary messages that you receive about African countries in particular growing up, it's a problem. It omits the beauty and richness of different people and cultures. Today's guest creates art that depicts the Africa that she has known since she was a child. Elizabeth Zunon was born in Albany, New York, but spent most of the first 13 years of her life in Côte d'Ivoire, also known as Ivory Coast. Today, she is an artist and illustrator who has depicted warm, loving, and inspiring characters from countries like Cameroon, Gambia, Malawi, and Tanzania. They are the kinds of characters that she remembers from her childhood, a childhood that she remembers fondly.
Racially, I identify as biracial. I grew up in the Ivory Coast, West Africa, and the word that we used to describe people like me was called métis, which I think is a version of mestizo in Spanish. And I had many friends that looked like me, that had one parent that was white and one parent that was Black African. So when I think of myself in the world, I think of myself as métis, but in English, I guess that would be biracial.
I know you grew up in Côte d'Ivoire, and I am wondering, at what age did you move from the United States to Côte d'Ivoire?
I was born here in Albany, New York, and I think I was probably 3 months old when my parents brought me back to Côte d'Ivoire. That's where they were living at the time, and basically I came here to be born to get that.
Oh, interesting.
And then we went back. My parents had been living there together for about 4 years at that time. So we lived in Côte d'Ivoire until full-time, pretty much full-time until the time that I was almost 13. But we came back to Albany, New York almost every summer to spend summertime with my grandparents here. So I was always kind of going back and forth, but I did most of my my schooling up until 7th grade in Côte d'Ivoire. So I've been here in the United States since the age of pretty much 13 or 8th grade.
So how did that affect your understanding of your own race, going from a country in West Africa to coming to the United States in the summer? It's like, how did that, impact your understanding of race as a child?
As a child, when I was here in the United States in the summertime, I was with my white family, and I definitely felt like there were not many people that looked like me. Definitely living in the United States, I felt like a minority. Back living as a child in Côte d'Ivoire, I didn't feel like I was that different than anyone else because there was just so many people that were, looked exactly like me.
Whenever you think about your time in Côte d'Ivoire, what, in comparing it to whenever you came to the United States as a 13-year-old, was it difficult to adjust to a more permanent space of living amongst people that don't all look like you?
I wouldn't say that it was any kind of like a difficult adjustment. If anything, my difficulty was adjusting to like the school system and speaking English every day rather than speaking French. But, you know, I had my mother with me and my father with me and my little brother. So we were always a little family unit wherever we were.
So, getting into books a little bit, you've written that your mother often read books to you as a child, bedtime books. What were some of those books? What kind of books do you remember?
The Snowy Day was very popular.
Ezra Jack Keats, very popular on this podcast.
Cherries and Cherry Pits is another one that I really liked. Written and illustrated by Vera B. Williams. Goodnight Moon. I Love You Forever, or I think it's I Love You Forever or I Love You Always, which I think we have in a couple different languages. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I had a bunch of books in French and in English as a child. I was living in the Ivory Coast. I was really into the Babysitter's Club, American series, and the American Girl books also.
You and my sisters in the same wavelength there.
Yeah.
So whenever you look back to these books, Snowy Day was kind of the most famous example for all ages or for many ages of the book that they had as a child. Did you, growing up in Côte d'Ivoire, were there any more access to books that were featuring characters that looked like you versus books in America?
I would say yes. We had a bunch of books that had African or, you know, people of brown color as the characters in the books. I went to a very nice private school, so we had access to a lot of different books. And definitely living in Africa, there are more books about African people and Black people than living in the United States, I would say. Mm-hmm.
Do you remember growing up as a child, both going to and from Africa to the United States? Do you have any distinct memories of a first racialized experience?
Oh,
I know it's the tough question.
I remember when I was in high school here in the United States. I was in my art class, and I don't know what project we were working on, but I had brought in a picture of myself and my mother. And one of my classmates asked me, "Oh, I didn't know you were adopted." And I kind of looked at her like, what does she mean? No, I didn't know how to respond. Mm-hmm. It didn't occur to me that Americans are not used to seeing people with parents of different colors. And if they see, you know, a brown child or a Black child with a white mother, they immediately assume, oh, they must be adopted, or, you know, that must not be your biological child. And I was like, okay, so that's how people think. Mm-hmm. It didn't offend me, but I was just confused why, first of all, why she thought that way and why she thought it would be appropriate to ask me or tell me, oh, you're adopted. Like, you know, even if you knew someone was adopted, I wouldn't think it would be appropriate to say that to their face or ask them that bluntly. So I was just taken aback by, okay, so it's not normal for people like me to be walking around, I guess.
I'm wondering if your parents had any type of conversations with you about that, you know, things might be a little different whenever we go to visit the grandparents, or anything like that you remember.
No, I don't remember any of those conversations, any like warning or telling me to like be careful or be aware of how people might view me. I do remember my mom telling me a story that when I was a little toddler in the summertime and she was pushing me around the stroller here in Albany, New York, someone came up to her and said, "Oh, like, bless you for adopting a little Black child." And my mother once again was like, what is she talking about? This is my child. I carried her. Like, she's my blood. But I've heard episodes like that my parents have told me, but they have never directly told me, okay, this is the way it's going to be. This is how people are going to view you. This is how we're going to like appear as a family. No, I don't remember any of those conversations.
Do you think about the racialized experiences of children growing up in the United States when you're illustrating books or anything like that? Or how do you think about that whenever because since your childhood was a little bit different, it seems, than growing kids that grow up in the United States their entire lives?
Yeah, when I'm creating the illustrations for my books, I definitely think about young children of color in the United States that are going to be looking at and reading these books. Um, and my goal is to depict Africans and African Americans in my books in a positive light. I remember, I think I was a young teenager at a bookstore here in Albany, and seeing a book that took place in Africa. And I was looking at the illustrations and I was like, well, that's not what we look like, or that's not how we dress, or like, that just looks like a weird alien drawing to me. And I felt like whoever illustrated this book didn't do any research about the culture that they were depicting. And I thought, when I'm working on my illustrations, I definitely don't want to make these same kind of mistakes to have a kid look at and say, well, that's weird, or that's not correct. So I definitely want to represent, different cultures of the world in a positive light.
No, that's something that I very much noticed, because I know your books have touched on real stories or nonfiction stories about featuring different countries, from Gambia to Cameroon to Malawi to Tanzania, and you can see that affection, I think, in your art. Your art paints just beautiful portraits of these characters in different ways, doing different things, and I think it's very evident to see that you have that affection. So when did whenever you started illustrating, was that something that you were like, this is what I'm going to be doing from the beginning? I'm going to be, making sure to kind of buck the harmful stereotypes that exist about African culture in the United States?
Yeah, when I began illustrating, I'm sorry?
Sorry, but really, I said those stereotypes exist in the United States, but they also exist plenty of other places too.
Sure, yeah. When I got my first illustration contract, I definitely felt like, okay, I've got my foot in the door of the book publishing industry, and if I can kind of walk through the door and stay within this career path that I chose, I definitely want to work towards creating beautiful books with beautiful characters of color. And I think that when I graduated from art school and was looking to put my portfolio out there, I think I just came into the book publishing industry at the correct time. There was starting to be more interest, I think, in creating books for young readers about people of color and people in Africa doing positive things. And, the first couple of books that I illustrated, they were looking for somebody who was an illustrator of color, and sometimes specifically they were looking for somebody who had spent time in Africa so that they could be sure to do the research and depict the African characters in a respectable or correct manner. So I definitely felt like, okay, I'm being given this role, and I'm gonna like really roll with it.
So at the same token, it's very apparent, like I said, in your art, that the affection that you have for the continent of Africa. But I'm wondering also if it's something where did you ever worry about being typecast as, there's an African book, we'll get Elizabeth Zunon to come in and do it, and as that being the only way that you can portray characters?
I definitely think about that, but I don't think about it as a bad thing. Obviously, I'm happy to have the work. I'm happy to be a working illustrator. And if they think of me for that one African thing, well, that's something that I'm proud of. And if they think of me for that, then that means that the books that I'm putting out there, the work that I'm doing is, being seen in a positive light. So even though maybe I am being typecast, I'll take it.
When you're writing, many of your books are from the nonfiction lens. So what draws you to illustrating those kinds of stories as compared to a fictional story?
I love learning about people that exist in the world, And when I get a manuscript in front of me, after I read it, I always try to think, what are the things that myself and this character or the story have in common? Oftentimes, I illustrate books about people that I have never met. So I try to draw connections between my life and their lives, or their experiences and mine, and see, well, if we ever met in real life, what are the things that we might be able to talk about easily?
Interesting. And can you walk me through a little bit of your process? I know in your recent book that you published, you'd walked through a whole lot of, there's a link that we have in our show notes about that walks you through your process. But I'm curious as to how, if you could just walk us through your process a little bit, because I know every artist kind of does things differently.
My illustration process, you mean, to create actual art?
Right, yeah.
Well, first I read the manuscript and I take notes and I just jot down the first things that come into my head, and I'll make little doodles or of images that pop into my mind as I'm reading. And then I kind of create a storyboard for the book. So usually it's a 32-page book, and I'll take a big piece of paper and draw 16 rectangles and draw a line down the middle. So there's a bunch of little boxes or rectangles for me to draw my little thumbnail sketches in. And then I'll dive into the research, whether it's reading companion books or looking on the internet for pictures of these people that I'm illustrating. And then I'll do a bunch of sketches, including one of the first things I do is a character sketch of the main character of the story. And it's easier for me to identify with the story, identify with the character, if I can look at them face to face. So if I know what they look like, I know how they carry themselves, I know how clothing looks on them, I know how I'm going to draw them and depict them. I always have that little character sketch next to me as I'm working on the rest of the drawings for the book. So after all my research, I'll draw a little thumbnail drawing for each of the pages, as I said in my storyboard. And then I will draw a large drawing, the same size that the final book will be, for each page. So I work at 100%. I'll draw, I'll kind of magnify my tiny little drawings into full-size drawings and add more detail. And this is the stage where I take a lot of reference pictures. I use myself as a model. It's the easiest thing right now. So I take a lot of pictures of myself posing in the different ways that I want to draw the characters on the page. So this helps me to draw them realistically with, properly limbs of proper length and positioning that looks realistic, rather than just trying to come up with it in my head. After I draw all of my full-size drawings, I will scan them. I will email them to the book publisher. So the art director and the editor will look them over. Sometimes they will send my sketches, my scans of my sketches, to the author of the book, in case they might have some specific things that they want me to avoid or make sure that I do or change. So once the author, the art director, and the editor look at the sketches, they determine, okay, she needs to change this and this and this. They'll send me back their notes, and then I will make my changes to my sketches. I will scan them back, send them back to them, and then when they give me final approval, then I transfer the sketches onto my paper for painting. So that's a whole other process of, measuring out, 16 or 17 pieces of watercolor paper, taping them down on my drawing boards, and then painting them with a layer of gesso, thick white acrylic paint, and then painting them with a layer of usually hot pink or like a salmon pink acrylic paint. And then from there, I will transfer my sketches onto my salmon pink acrylic background, and I will paint my characters with oil paint, paint the skies and the grounds. And usually if I'm doing collage as well, when the paint is drying, then I will go into my decorative paper collection and kind of take out, okay, well, this would look good for the shirt, or this would look good for the tree in the background. And I will trace and cut the shapes of the other things that I have not painted, and I will paste them onto my painting. So it's a very long process.
It is an involved process, that's for sure.
Yes.
At what point, whenever you are actually doing the painting, what how I noticed in that again, I'm an art newbie, and I won't pretend to be an expert, but it seems that you use light and shadows very effectively, according to my layman eye. And I'm wondering how conscious of you are how light and shadows affect the skin color of your characters.
I love the effect of light on skin. I love the effect of bright highlights on dark skin. And I love the warm tones of a lot of the different brown skin colors that I use. And I had mentioned that I use a hot pink or salmon pink acrylic paint background for all of my paintings, illustrations. That's because I like the way this warm salmon color peeks through in unexpected ways, especially in like brown and dark brown skin tones. So I love light, and I also love the effect of warmth kind of underneath the skin, and that's something that I try to portray when I'm painting.
Well, it makes sense because I know the first book that I read of yours was Lala Salama, and I was reading it with a young child, and they said, or they didn't say anything, I was said in my head that the book was so warm and loving, and the colors were so warm, so it makes sense that you have these like a character in that sense that, you know, it's a mother-child relationship, and it's a loving relationship. It makes sense that those warm colors would be reflective.
Yeah, absolutely. And with that book in particular, the author, Patricia McLaughlin, sent me reference pictures of people that lived in the villages that inspired her to write this story. So I was looking at portraits of real people, and that really helped me make a connection because I've never been to Tanzania. I've never, rocked a baby to sleep. So it really helped me to, to kind of create a relationship between myself and the real people that inspired this book.
And that's something that I also like about your art, is that these people look like people, and they, there's artistic. I mean, it's not a picture, but they look like people. They look relatable, and I think is that something that you tried to consciously do, is make these people, like you said, look like people that you might meet?
Yeah, absolutely. And also when I'm painting, sometimes I think this portrait of this character in this book might look like somebody's mom or somebody's sister or somebody's brother. And it really excites me that I'm inspired by, faces in the world, and I'm trying to put out work that is respecting of, the real people that exist in the world.
So why children's books? You seem, I'm not editing. This is no way to say that, like, why stoop to children's books. That's not what I'm saying at all. It's just, I'm curious as to what draws you to children's books, because I've interviewed other artists who have done different kinds of things in addition to children's books, but you seem very focused and very talented at creating images for children's books and picture books. So why those books?
Good question. I love children. I love stories. I love listening to stories and being read stories. And maybe one reason I gravitate towards children's books is because my childhood in Côte d'Ivoire is such a precious kind of memory that I carry with me. Mm-hmm. And I'm always thinking about my childhood and the friends I had during my childhood and the places that we would go when I was a kid. So I feel like childhood is a really precious thing. And sometimes people look down on the art of children's books or the word illustration in general. It's kind of like a dirty word in the art world.
I did not know that.
Or at least that's how I have felt. And I feel like, well, why not elevate children's books to a level that could be, equal with a fine art painting? And that therefore I'm going to make 18 really great fine art paintings for this children's book and show that this art form can be really, can be produced with really quality art. And it's not, it's not a haphazard, half thought through piece of art. I don't want to say I slaved over this, but I gave my entire heart and soul to create these pieces of art which tell somebody's story.
Well, I think that I mean, I think you have produced fine art in these books. If you take out the words, and you could put it in a museum, as far as I'm concerned. But I'm wondering, though, you have a book coming out this year, I believe, correct? Grandpa Cacao?
Yeah.
So this is the first book that you have authored and illustrated. So I'm curious as to what that process has been like for you, with not having other people's words, creating your own words and then creating images off your own words. And I'm wondering, did the images come first? Did the story come first? How does that work whenever it's your own words and your own images?
Well, for Grandpa Cacao, speaking of childhood, I was inspired by my father's childhood in Côte d'Ivoire. When we lived in Côte d'Ivoire, when I was a kid, we lived in the big economic capital in Abidjan. And I never experienced village life. I never experienced farm life the way that my father had when he was growing up. And when I was in college, he started to share, little snippets of his life living in the village. He lost both of his parents when he was pretty young. So, this book started off kind of like as an investigation into my father's childhood, because he never spoke about it when I was a child myself. So this book, Grandpa Cacao, started off with an interview that I did with my dad, where he talked about his childhood, and one of the things he mentioned was following his father to his father's cacao and coffee plantation in the village. So I immediately, could picture, my father as a little boy, like walking through the bush and carrying a big empty basket on his head, and helping his father cut down the fruits from the trees and cut the fruits open and scoop out the beans and lay them out to dry. And the more I heard about this and the more research I did on my own about the process of harvesting cacao beans, getting them ready to ship off to chocolate factories for us to make chocolate, the more I was really confused that there existed no children's book on the market that I could find that talked about this process, because chocolate is such a commodity that I think everybody loves and we all take for granted, but we don't realize that a farmer thousands of miles away cut down a fruit from the tree and did all these steps to prepare it so that we could have chocolate. So it started off with an interview, and then I did some sketches, and then I happened to be in art school at the Rhode Island School of Design at the time, and I used this childhood memory of harvesting cacao as the subject matter for a picture book that I was writing for a picture book class. So that was my first opportunity to write the story and illustrate the story. So there's a lot of research and sketches and paintings, and so that college, art school project stayed in the back of my mind after I graduated. And I met my agent, who helped me really perfect the manuscript. And she helped me figure out, what things I should cut out, what kind of things would be more interesting to add, kind of helped me streamline the story into something that would be more palatable for, a trade book publisher to be interested in. So there's always back and forth between editing the text and editing the sketches, editing the text and editing the sketches. And then finally, when it came down to creating the final art for this book, I used my usual techniques of oil paint and collage, cut paper collage. But then I wanted to add another level of interest to the visual images and to the story. So I had gotten into silk screening a while back, and I figured I could try to tell the grandfather story through different silk screens, kind of on top of the paintings, the painted and collaged background. So there was a lot of back and forth from my writing side of my brain to my art side of my brain, and then also getting input from my agent, my editor, my art director into what would make, the most comprehensive kind of product that could tell this story faithfully, I guess.
Well, I've read the book yet, obviously, but from the cover, it looks like a pretty looks like I'm going to check it out. I can say that much.
Cool, thanks.
So when do you anticipate the Grandpa Cacao coming out? When can people actually get their hands on this book, you think?
May 21st of this year.
Perfect. May 21st. Sounds great. Elizabeth Zunon, thank you so much for joining us today.
Awesome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you.
In My Skin is a production of the University of Pittsburgh P.R.I.D.E program, which stands for Positive Racial Identity Development and Early Education. P.R.I.D.E is part of Pitt's Office of Child Development. You can find every episode of In My Skin at racepride.pitt.edu. And you can find more about the Office of Child Development at ocd.pitt.edu. Special thanks to our funders, the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and Hillman Family Foundations. This episode was produced by me, Adam Flango, with help from P.R.I.D.E Director Aisha White and P.R.I.D.E Director of Engagement Medina Jackson. Music for this episode is by Blue Dot Sessions. Make sure to subscribe to In My Skin anywhere you get podcasts, and tell a friend if you like it.